On the island of Hispaniola, specifically in the part bordered off as the nation of Haiti, archaeologists have found something incredible. Over the course of several decades, a series of excavations at a site called Puerto Real have uncovered some special artifacts. One discovery in particular, though it might initially have seemed quite innocuous, is especially interesting. Experts found what appeared to be part of an old cow's tooth. Big deal, right? Well, it turned out to be pretty significant indeed. This tooth, it became clear, was the key to unlocking a secret that had long baffled experts. An ancient tooth could solve the centuries-old mystery of these rare island ponies. The person responsible for solving this riddle was Dr. Nicholas Del Sol, a researcher from the Florida Museum of Natural History. He got his hands on the ancient tooth after it had been discovered, intending to use it to figure out how exactly cows had come to be domesticated throughout the Americas. He planned to do that by analyzing the tooth's DNA, which is exactly what he did. But once he got stuck into that task, he discovered something surprising. This tooth wasn't what he had initially presumed. In an article for the Florida Museum website dated July 27, 2022, Dr. Del Sol was quoted discussing the moment his study of this tooth was totally flipped on its head. He said, "It was a serendipitous finding. I was sequencing mitochondrial DNA from fossil cow teeth for my PhD and realized something was very different with one of the specimens when I analyzed the sequences." But what was different? Well, it became clear to Dr. Del Sol that this tooth belonged not to a cow but a horse. Now, the average person is unlikely to immediately grasp why that's of any particular interest. And, in truth, Dr. Del Sol himself wasn't totally blown away at first, either. His expertise lay with cows, so when he discovered the tooth had belonged to a horse, he basically put it aside for a while. He had been completing research involving cattle at the time, and, as he put it to website Atlas Obscura in August 2022, "I was really focused on my cows." But as a person of science, Dr. Del Sol couldn't suppress his curiosity about the horse tooth forever. He was confident, after all, that this thing would contain secrets of its own, even if they differed from what he'd initially set out to find. So, he got stuck into the job and was soon joining some very unexpected dots. He linked this horse tooth with a specific breed that so many people across the United States hold very closely to their hearts. The breed in question is the Chincoteague pony, which holds a special place throughout America thanks to a classic book. Marguerite Henry's Misty of Chincoteague hit bookshelves for the first time back in 1947. Before long, it obtained classic status. Telling the tale of two kids and their Chincoteague pony, the book was even adapted into a movie down the line. People clearly loved this story, which relied so much on this particular breed of horse and its backstory. But Dr. Del Sol wasn't to know any of this at first. Dr. Del Sol is French, so he obviously wasn't totally aware of the extent to which many Americans loved the Chincoteague pony. He explained, "Chincoteague pony didn't ring a bell because I'm from France. I thought, okay, I don't know that breed. What are these? Where do they come from?" But once he started looking into it, the reality began to dawn on him. "So many people told me it was a very significant red when they were young," he said. "I learned a lot about American culture." Despite being named after the island of Chincoteague, which sits off the coast of Virginia, this breed of horse is actually more closely associated with a neighboring island called Assateague. Feral Chincoteague ponies have been known to gallop throughout Assateague Island for several centuries, but questions have always lingered about how this came to be. Nobody really knows when or how these horses ended up here, nor from where they had originated. It's been such a big mystery for so long. Dr. Del Sol suddenly found himself attempting to solve it. One of the reasons people are so fascinated by the question of how the ponies ended up on both Chincoteague and Assateague relates to the conditions on the islands. These places aren't exactly the most suitable for these animals to thrive. Their options for food are pretty poor here, meaning they eat a lot of marsh grass. This is a salt-heavy diet, which means they need to drink more water than they otherwise would, leaving them looking bloated. Besides that, the diet here means they don't grow very large. Several theories have been formulated to account for the Chincoteague pony's presence on these islands, the most fantastical sounding of which was immortalized in Henry's book Mystery of Chincoteague. Basically, this idea has it that the horses we see on Assateague today actually descended from a group that washed ashore on the island following a shipwreck hundreds of years ago. It's a pretty far-fetched idea, and no evidence beyond folklore ever really existed for it. That is, until Dr. Del Sol got involved. In order to wrap our heads around this story, we'll need to take a look at the brutal history of Hispaniola from the dawn of the 16th century. If we travel back to the year 1503, we find ourselves in an era of Spanish colonization. The Spaniards made it to Hispaniola, where they established a settlement known as Puerto Real. We must remember, of course, that Spanish colonialism was an astoundingly violent endeavor that wiped out indigenous people and forced them into slavery. This lies at the heart of Puerto Real's history. Kathleen Deegan is an archaeologist who works at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, and she knows a thing or two about Puerto Real. At its peak, she explained to Atlas Obscura, the industry at Puerto Real was mostly based on contraband. Illegal trade off the north coast with the Portuguese, French, and English corsairs and pirates. She believes this tendency for illegal trading can be explained by geographical considerations, as Puerto Real was situated far from other major trading routes. That meant people based there were likely to work with whatever they could get their hands on. Deegan noted, the government of Spain tried to get them to stop, but they just wouldn't. In 1577, that situation came to a head when the Spanish authorities took drastic action. Tired of the unruly nature of Puerto Real, they forced its inhabitants to move elsewhere and destroyed the settlement once and for all. The ruins would stand there untouched for centuries before archaeologists finally started to take an interest in the place in the 1970s. Many items have been recovered from the Puerto Real site over the years, including a bunch of bones and teeth. And one tooth in particular, as we've already seen, is what captured Dr. Del Sol's attention. Wanting to learn about cattle, as he did, he investigated this supposed cow's tooth, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. He explained, as soon as the organism dies, the DNA starts to degrade, especially in really hot areas. It doesn't preserve well. Given this situation, Dr. Del Sol focused his efforts on analyzing the mitochondrial DNA within the tooth. There are several reasons for this, but in layman's terms we can say this type of DNA is found in greater amounts than nuclear DNA and is just generally simpler to get to. In short, there would be a greater chance of success for Dr. Del Sol at less expense. So, as he put it, we aimed at what we could get, and it gives a lot of information about the ancestry of an organism. It was during this process that Dr. Del Sol came to realize he wasn't looking at the tooth of a cow. Comparing sequences on my computer, I thought, wait, this doesn't look right, he told Atlas Obscura. This isn't cow DNA. A little further investigation made it clear to him that it had belonged to a horse, which was of little interest to him at the time. But he eventually became interested in that idea, which then took him to some weird places. He established the horse was a close relative of the Chincoteague pony, which opened up a whole can of worms. This began Dr. Del Sol's journey into learning about the Chincoteague pony. He heard about the breed's significance within the Mystery of Chincoteague book, and he came to appreciate how important this animal was for many Americans. And, of course, he came to learn that the origins of the Chincoteague pony were highly disputed. It's funny how these things work out, because he was soon going to be playing a major part in helping to solve this question once and for all. For a long time, even before the publication of Mystery of Chincoteague, it was rumored that the horses had ended up on Assateague because of a shipwreck. They'd been aboard, but washed up on the shores of the island and gone on to reproduce. Henry had committed that idea to the page in her story, but there was never any evidence for it. On top of that, there were other theories of how they had ended up there, too. Another idea stated that the horses had been brought to the island by settlers from England, where they had been abandoned. Proponents of the English settler version of the tale could bat away the theory of a Spanish shipwreck pretty easily with a simple point. There was never a shipwreck that matched the description discovered in the area. Having said that, there was evidence of ships having sunk there. Historical records state that two Spanish ships, La Galga and Juno, went under in 1750 and 1802, respectively. And artifacts that could have been aboard these ships had actually been found. Things like coins and even an anchor have been discovered, but where the ships themselves were had never been established. To be sure, people have tried to find the lost vessels. John Amrane Jr., an historian with a particular interest in the sea, is one such individual who's done what he can to track one of them down. He's been searching for La Galga for decades now, going back as far back as the 80s. And, well, he thinks he knows where it is. Amazingly, he doesn't think it's in the sea at all, but rather on Assateague Island proper. He suspects it's buried beneath the sands in a part of the island that was once an inlet. The records we have about La Galga state that the people who'd been aboard when it sank had taken their belongings off the ship. Then, when the ship washed ashore, much of its wreckage was salvaged. That means there won't be much of the ship left nowadays, but Amrane thinks there might be enough there to point towards the presence of horses. You may find horseshoes, tack, or horse dung, he argued. That could happen. That's just a possibility. I hope there is something that proves the horses were aboard. Amrane has repeatedly undertaken surveys in the area he thinks the ship might be in, but he's never managed to secure permission to excavate the area. The reason, he believes, is because relevant authorities in this case, the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which both oversee different parts of Assateague, have always supported the theory that English settlers brought the ponies to the island. They want to discredit the shipwreck legend, Amrane claimed. They're trying to halt my archaeological investigation. They don't want it to happen because if I find the wreck, there will be a political controversy. It's pretty wild to think that something like this could generate such controversy, but that's exactly what's happened here. And there are a lot of different players involved in the dispute, too. In addition to Amrane, a salvaging company, government officials from Virginia, and even the Spanish government are all engaged in this squabble. Everyone has their own interests, and any genuine signs of progress are difficult to identify. As Amrane plainly put it, treasure fever does crazy things to people. Back in 1997, the salvaging company in question made a big claim. It said it had discovered both La Galga and Juno. But rather than presenting the wrecks of these vessels, it merely showed off some coins and other items that it had recovered. As Amrane sees it, those artifacts may have come from any shipwreck. Still, the Spanish government jumped on it and agreed that these items had come from La Galga and Juno. Why? Well, they'd never officially abandoned those ships, so they could claim ownership of them now. And if those coins had come from the vessels, the Spanish government could claim them. A court actually agreed with the Spanish government's claim to the ships, which has made things difficult for Amrane. If he wants to excavate the site where he thinks La Galga lies today, he needs to seek authorization from the Spanish government. Not only that, but he also needs to recognize Spain's ownership of the wreck. Neither of these requirements sits at all well with him, and he won't play ball. His work to find La Galga, then, has been stymied, but he hopes Dr. Del Sol's studies might actually help him out down the line. When Dr. Del Sol was analyzing the results of the tests he'd undertaken on the horse tooth, he couldn't escape a particular conclusion. The evidence implied that horses had arrived on Assateague as a result of Spanish activity. As he explained to the Florida Museum website, it's not widely reported in the historical literature, but the Spanish were exploring this area of the mid-Atlantic pretty early on in the 16th century. The early colonial literature is often patchy and not completely thorough. Just because they don't mention the horses doesn't mean they weren't there. As a rule, though, finding hard evidence of horses around Puerto Real is really difficult. While there are plenty of cow bones lying around the place, it's no surprise the tooth was initially labeled as such. Horse bones are rare. The reason for that, as Dr. Del Sol has explained, is because of the specific places those animals respectively held within the culture. He said, horses were reserved for individuals of high status, and owning one was a sign of prestige. There are full-page descriptions of horses in the documents that chronicle the arrival of Hernan Cortés in Mexico, demonstrating how important they were to the Spanish. Cows, on the other hand, were quite a different story. They were a more common animal, widely used for meat and leather. The leftover bones would be tossed away in big piles known as middens, hence they're so easy for archaeologists to find today. But, as it happens, a horse tooth was indeed discovered, and Dr. Del Sol has used it to unlock some secrets. He compared the DNA of this horse tooth with that of modern horses from across the globe today. His expectation had been that this horse would be related to breeds found in southern Europe today, working from the presumption that this horse would have descended from those brought to Hispaniola by Spanish explorers. He was wrong. No, the closest living relative of this old horse he was analyzing was based 1,000 or so miles from Hispaniola, on the Isle of Assateague. So, what conclusions can we draw from that? Well, this finding might actually support that age-old story that the Chincoteague pony did actually end up on Assateague as a result of a Spanish shipwreck. Think about it. The tooth found at Puerto Real belonged to a horse whose descendants ended up on Assateague, 1,000 miles away. Puerto Real was a Spanish trading town, so it's not unthinkable that horses may have been transported aboard Spanish ships. Then, it's not too much of a stretch to suggest one of these horse-carrying vessels sank off the coast of Virginia and some horses washed up on Assateague Island. Given the importance to many Americans of the Chincoteague pony and the story of how it ended up on islands off Virginia, it's maybe no surprise that Dr. Del Sol's work has been widely reported. Major publications including National Geographic, The Washington Post, and Popular Science have all published stories about it, but not everyone has been overly struck by excitement about the developments. The Chincoteague Volunteer Fire Company actually owns the Chincoteague ponies, and a spokesman delivered quite a muted statement to Atlas Obscura. The findings are quite exciting and definitely lend value to the legend, they said. However, as the primary caregivers of the herd, our concentration remains solely in that capacity. Other relevant organizations refused to comment outright, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. A rep from the National Park Service's Assateague Island National Seashore Wing, meanwhile, said, "While Assateague has no immediate plans to make significant changes to our outreach materials, park staff will continue to review the information from this recent genetic study and will share these findings with other scientists, historians, and visitors as appropriate." It's not a comment that especially presents the organization as being particularly interested. This rep from the National Park Service also sent Atlas Obscura a report from 2005 concerning the genetics of horses found on Assateague. This document didn't address the thorny issue of where the ponies might have originated from at all, while the material it contained related to their genetics wasn't exactly extensive. It referenced a study into their DNA, which, compared to the work conducted by Dr. Del Sol, just didn't match up. The latter's study was far larger in scope. Dr. Del Sol has personally reviewed the 2005 study. He's confident his approach is far more appropriate. He argues that his work can trace the lineage of the horse from Puerto Real far more accurately than the approach described in the report. He holds, in his words, relatively high confidence about that. Still, he doesn't actually claim his work is anything like conclusive. It's a start, but more research is needed to prove the Chincoteague pony arrived on Assateague via a Spanish shipwreck. The other theories about how the Chincoteague ponies showed up off the coast of Virginia can just be discarded because of Dr. Del Sol's findings. After all, while his research may be more in-depth than previous studies, it can't prove anything beyond doubt. Indeed, the theory that the horses came from English sailors rather than Spanish ones can't be ignored. So much trade was happening across the Atlantic during those days, and Puerto Real was very much a part of it. One notable detail in this mystery worth bearing in mind is that historical records contain no mention of wild horses on Assateague before English settlers showed up. In fact, they're only ever mentioned quite a bit after they arrived during the 17th century. Horses were really useful, and they were worth a pretty penny, too, so it seems unlikely they wouldn't have been documented if they'd already been on the island. As Amrain told Atlas Obscura, they didn't mention them. They would have mentioned them. Dr. Del Sol believes the mystery of the Chincoteague ponies and their origins are part of a much wider story about the colonial era and the age of exploration. Was it a shipwreck? He pondered. We cannot say. All we can say is that they are really closely related to Spanish horses from Hispaniola. The main Spanish explorations focused on the Caribbean and Mexico, but they were also present in the mid-Atlantic. It's highly plausible that the Spanish were around this area. Dr. Del Sol is continuing his work on the horsetooth from Puerto Real, but his efforts are now part of a more expansive investigation into the history of horses throughout the Americas. He's not working alone, and with one colleague in particular, he's attempting to draw out nuclear DNA from the tooth in the hope of sequencing it. They're on the lookout for any more signs that might reveal details like where the horse was born. They want, in Dr. Del Sol's words, to clarify the history of these horses, to complete the story that we can tell. The Chincoteague ponies of Assateague are far from the only horses to run wild throughout the Americas today. In fact, according to figures from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, there are something like 86,000 wild horses roaming around the United States alone, mostly in the West. Within these populations are animals that have descended from those who were brought to the New World by Europeans and managed to escape captivity. It's a complex story, and one on which Dr. Del Sol hopes to shed light. As Dr. Del Sol and his colleagues move forward with their analysis of the Puerto Real tooth, the hope is that they might finally put the question of the Chincoteague pony origin story to bed. That's a possibility, of course, but it's by no means a certainty. The other side of the coin, and maybe this is even more likely, is that whatever findings they manage to reach will just complicate the tale even more. Such is the joy of scientific investigation. In any case, the Chincoteague ponies will continue to roam in their herds across their 2 islands off the coast of Virginia. The distinct, fascinating creatures are actually a big tourist attraction, pulling in large numbers of people to come visit at the height of summer. An especially noteworthy event each year is when the horses actually swim through the channel between the 2 islands of Assateague and Chincoteague. It's really quite the sight to behold, watching these beasts pass through the water. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.